You're looking for an audio interface that actually lets you work without second-guessing your levels, that stays out of the way while you're tracking, and that feels like a solid investment instead of a vanity gadget. Most of the time the hype around next-gen converters and hundreds of plugins makes it hard to know whether you'll end up with a tool that simply sits on a shelf. I get that hesitation, especially when you've probably burned a few dollars on gear that sounded great on paper but was a pain to integrate into a daily home studio routine. The risk is spending on a device that sounds amazing in the showroom but ends up demanding a steep learning curve or a workstation you don't have. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. In the next few minutes I'll walk through what the Apollox 6 Gen 2 actually feels like when you plug it into a typical project studio setup, where it shines, and where you might be better off looking elsewhere. First off, the Apollox 6 isn't just another USB box. It's a Thunderbolt 3 interface that sits in the middle of Universal Audio's long-standing lineup, and that matters because the ecosystem is built around real-time DSP processing. What you get right out of the box is access to over 200 UAD plugins, everything from classic analog emulations to modern compressors. If you already own a handful of UAD plugins, the X6 lets you run them with zero latency, which is a game changer for tracking vocals or guitars. You can hear the effect of a Neve preamp or an SSL channel strip while you're singing, rather than having to re-record later. That said, the real-world test isn't just about the plugin library. I set up the X6 in a modest home studio that runs a MacBook Pro with a couple of external monitors, a couple of condenser mics, and a small PA subwoofer for low-end reference. The first thing I noticed was how quickly auto-gain locked in a usable level across two vocal mics and a line-in instrument. Within seconds the interface raised or lowered the preamp gain so that the signal landed nicely in the 0 dB to -12 dB sweet spot. In practice that saved me the habit of hunting for the right knob position while the performer was already on the mic. It's a small convenience, but when you're doing a 5-hour session, those seconds add up. Now, the conversion quality is where Universal Audio leans heavily on its reputation. The next-generation converters promise the widest dynamic range you'll find at this price point, and in my listening tests the difference showed up when I recorded an acoustic guitar in a bright room. The low-end detail was present without any noticeable grain, and the highs stayed airy without becoming harsh. When I routed that same track through the built-in bass management, the subwoofer in my near-field monitor system responded with a clean, tight low-frequency extension that let me hear how the guitar sat in the mix. If you're a producer who mixes in a room that isn't perfectly treated, that extra low-end transparency can be a lifesaver. But there are trade-offs that often get buried under the marketing. The X6 has 6 analog inputs, which sounds generous until you realize that you can't expand beyond that without adding another interface or a rack box. For a small project studio that records a few instruments at a time, that's fine. If your workflow involves a larger drum kit with multiple overheads, room mics, and direct boxes, you'll quickly hit the input ceiling. The device also leans heavily on Thunderbolt 3, so you need a compatible computer. Users on older Macs or Windows machines without Thunderbolt ports will need an adapter, and that can introduce latency or stability quirks that are not ideal when you're relying on real-time plugin monitoring. Another practical point: the UAD plugins run on the interface's built-in DSP chips, not your computer's CPU. In theory that offloads processing power, but in my tests the DSP resources can fill up if you stack too many heavy plugins on a single track. I tried running a full chain of emulated preamp, EQ, compressor, and tape saturation on a drum bus, and the interface started to flag a DSP overload warning. The workaround is to bounce or freeze tracks, which adds an extra step to the workflow. If you're a producer who lives on massive plugin stacks, you'll need to plan your session layout accordingly. The price tag reflects the premium positioning of the brand, and the value proposition hinges on how much you'll actually use the UAD plugin library. If you're already subscribed to UAD or you have a collection of those plugins, the X6 essentially unlocks a hardware-accelerated version of what you already own, and the conversion quality makes that a worthwhile upgrade from a cheaper 2-in/2-out interface. If, however, you're just starting out and haven't invested in UAD plugins, you'll be paying for a lot of potential you might never tap. In that case, a simpler Focusrite or PreSonus interface could give you more inputs for less money while still delivering respectable sound. So, who should buy?